Hey guys, it is me, the former film student, back today with another episode of my 31 Nights, 31 Frights series, a series where I review a different horror film every day of October, and today I'm continuing my Wes Craven trend and reviewing his 1984 classic, A Nightmare on Elm Street. So, A Nightmare on Elm Street, there's not a lot to say about this movie that hasn't already been said. It was released years and years ago, like I said, 1984. It is one of the most culturally iconic horror films of all time. Freddy Krueger is one of the most recognizable characters from any horror film. He has so many distinguishable features. The striped sweater vest, the claws for fingers, the hat, his scars on his face. He was one of the only characters who didn't have, like, a mask. Obviously, it was, like, a prosthetic mask, but you get what I'm saying. He didn't have like a Michael Myers mask or a hockey mask, for Jason. But yeah, no, Nightmare on Elm Street, I have so many thoughts about this movie. It's one of my favorite horror films of all time. It's one that if, you're trying to get into horror films or you're into current horror films and you want to go back and check out some of the classics of the genre, this is one that I always recommend to people. Robert Englund is fantastic as Freddy Krueger. For me, Freddy Krueger was that one horror film character, that one thing that when you're really young, and I'm not even like teenagers, I'm talking like 7, 8 years old, that really creeped me out. The concept of a guy who could come into your dreams and kill you while you were asleep was what always like really got to me, because me being a little naive child thought, oh, if Freddy Krueger, or sorry, not Freddy Krueger, if Jason Voorhees or Michael Myers was like chasing after me, I could like try to fight back, or I could run away, or I can evade them, something like that. I don't know, I was a dumb kid. But yeah, Freddy Krueger to me, I was like, well, you have to sleep at some point, you can't just like live without sleeping, eventually you're gonna have to like, fall asleep. So I was like, so you could just never escape Freddy Krueger. He could just come after you, he could just wait in the shadows, and then when you're finally asleep, kill you. And it was just, I don't know, that was just my thing as a kid. But I mentioned it in my Scream review, but that little jingle for Freddy, that 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you, 3, 4, better lock your door. That, I don't play with that. That is just so scary. It's just so creepy, man. Something about like little kids jump roping and singing that song just always like struck fear in me as a kid when I saw this film. And that was before I was like really in love with horror films. I watched them when I was young, but they actually like really made me uncomfortable as a kid. And it wasn't until I became like, 12, 13 years old that I really started to get into those horror films. But yeah, this one always got to me. The music in this movie, still to this day, I think is one of the best horror themes ever written. It is incredibly, incredibly creepy. It's one that anytime I'm writing a horror film, or a horror script, or something that has just darker tones, is like a thriller, I always play that music. And like I mentioned in my Scream review, he sort of opts to go against like using like the conventional piano or a violin or even like a synth score. He uses this sort of like very evil, very melancholy choir that sings like these really weird notes, and I don't know how to explain it. I'll probably play the music in this video, so Jake, when you're editing this, make sure to play that. But yeah, the music is incredibly well done in this movie. It just adds another layer of atmosphere in this movie. And I apologize if I use the word atmosphere in too many of my reviews, but for me, atmosphere in a film and tone is just so important. And I think that's why I love the first Nightmare on Elm Street the most in the entire franchise. Not just because, obviously, it's the first and probably the most competently made and directed, but for me, it has the most serious tone out of the bunch. As the films progress in the franchise, Freddy Krueger kind of becomes more and more comedic, and although sometimes I think comedy can work with a character, I think like Scream, the comedy in that works really well because it's sort of parodying horror films in a sense and playing on the tropes and the cliches of them. But with this one, which was just trying to be a straight-up horror film, I prefer just the more serious take. And although in some of the sequels, Freddy does have some really funny one-liners, I just think I prefer my Freddy Krueger to be just a little more serious, taken a little more seriously, because in the end, he's just one of those guys who just always creep me out. So when they sort of make a joke out of him, it sort of takes away from that fear factor. The movie is incredibly well directed. I think a lot of the special effects, while maybe are a little dated looking back, I really am so happy that they went for practical effects over some really crappy, shitty CGI at the time. Because if you think some CGI is crappy today, the technology that they had in the 80s is really, really, really bad. So I'm glad that they didn't try to do some really dated CGI or computer generated effects. And I'm really glad they went with a lot of practical effects. Some of them look a little goofy, specifically one scene in general. But I kind of like that scene. I always had like an affinity for that scene, even though it is a little goofy and it takes me out of the movie a little bit. I think just like the atmosphere of the movie, the tone of that scene, just Freddy Krueger and Robert Englund giving such a great performance, and just the other actors in the film. The acting in this film, I think, is pretty good. It can be a little flat at times, but I think that has more to do with the dialogue than the actual performances, because I think they're all very capable actors. John Saxon is great in it. And it also introduced us to Johnny Depp, which I think is pretty cool. A lot of, famous actors nowadays got their start in horror films. We have Johnny Depp in this, Kevin Bacon's in the first Friday the 13th, obviously, Jamie Lee Curtis in Halloween. But yeah, so, there's a lot to love about this film. I think Wes Craven did an excellent job directing it. I think it's such an innovative and creative horror film to take the genre that, might have been getting a little stale at the time and a little dry, because you already had Black Christmas, you had Texas Chainsaw Massacre in the 70s, and then, Halloween in the late 70s, introducing Michael Myers, which is still sort of like the definitive slasher movie to this day. Then you had Jason with the Friday the 13th movies. And then Wes Craven really comes out and does what he always does and really makes a creative and innovative film that sort of takes the genre and does something really unique, really interesting with it. And we've seen him do that multiple times in his career. And just, this is what sort of started it all, taking the concept of a serial killer, which we've seen time and time again, and really putting a fun, unique twist on it, having him be able to enter people's dreams and adding, the slasher element, which was always more of a, I guess, realistic look at a horror film as opposed to supernatural elements, but infusing those supernatural elements into the more, serious and realistic serial killer stuff. I think it just played really well. It blended really well and was a really nice mixture and really made Nightmare on Elm Street stand out amongst the other horror films at the time. So that's really all I have to say about this movie. I don't have a lot of issues with it. It's a classic for a reason. Freddy Krueger in the film is incredibly terrifying, really creepy. Still to this day is one of the movies that, from that time period, still scare me. Robert Englund is great as the character. The directing by Wes Craven is really good. I really love the production value in this film. Some of the special effects don't really hold up as well as other films from that time period, but I still think that they do a really good job. And the decision to use practical effects over CGI, I will always love that. Nothing worse than seeing dated CGI in an old film. But yeah, so I don't really have anything else to say about this movie. If you've seen Nightmare on Elm Street, let me know what you think about it. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it to any fans of horror, or if you just want to go see an old classic movie from the 80s that, is a cultural icon for a reason. It created one of the most famous characters of all time. Yeah. So let me know what you think. I'd love to create a dialogue in the comment section. As always, if you liked this video, make sure to click the like button and subscribe to me if you want to hear more from me. Make sure to click the little bell notification so you get notified when I post new videos. Keep looking forward to new episodes in my October series, 31 Nights, 31 Frights, where I review a different horror film every movie from the 1st all the way to the 31st. Alright guys, I will see you next time.